of course with a focus on with an eye towards the Arab Spring. And I'm just delighted that my dear colleague and friend Khaleh Esfandiari, director of our Middle East program, is chairing this event. All I know about the Middle East and all I know about chairing events, I know from Khaleh. So I'm delighted that she's joining us today. She's a real institution here at the center and in Washington, and there's a longer bio of hers with all of her publication, and of course including her story, My Prison, My Home, One Woman's Story of Captivity in Iran, as well as her other scholarly publications are mentioned there, and all the other credentials and accomplishments. So I'll just turn it over to her now to chair this session, and look forward to the papers.
Thank you very much, Christian. You didn't say that your mother, who is visiting from Germany, is reading my book, and she's quite impressed.
She's counting every fan.
It's important. Of course. Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here. And I think I would have been heartbroken if there would have been a meeting on women and youth, especially women in the Arab Spring, and Christian would have not asked me to play a role. So I thank him for inviting me, and we are having a wonderful panel. You have the bios of the speakers. We will start with Sharon Wolczyk, who is a professor at George Washington University in the Elliott School of International Affairs. Move on to Luciana, who will be here any minute. But if she's not here, we will go then to Susan Pierce, who is an assistant professor at the East Carolina University in the Department of Sociology. And then once all our three speakers have made their comments, then I will turn to Lubna and ask her to be the commentator. Some of you know how strict I am when I said 10 minutes, so I will urge the speakers to really stick to their 10 minutes. Otherwise, I have the permission from them and from the supreme leader, Christian, to stop them, and because we would really like to have a discussion, and that is very important for us. In the audience, we have also Marina Ottaway, who is an expert on this issue too. So I hope that she will step in at some stage also and say something. So with having said that, Sharon, you have the floor, 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to note that I'm starting at 1:23. All right. All right. I was asked to talk about the role of women and I guess youth, but I will confess that I sort of forgot about youth in the written part of this, and I will tack it on in my comments at the end, assuming I have any time. But if you look at the role of women in the transitions from communist rule in Central and Eastern Europe, my argument is that they played an exceedingly important role both directly and indirectly. If you look at and I also included, as you may have noticed, the so-called electoral or color revolutions and women's roles in these events, because in my view, that is an important part, in fact, of the transition in a number of countries in the region. We had this sort of interim period of non-communist but semi-authoritarian or hybrid rule, and I think it merits looking at women's role in those events also. But if we look at women's roles in the events of 1989 and the end of communism, it's clear that they played a greater role in those cases in which the end of communism came about as a result of mass demonstrations by hundreds of thousands of citizens in the squares than they did in the so-called pacted revolutions that are generally held to have occurred in this region, in Hungary, where you had what has been described as the negotiated revolution, and in Poland, where you had roundtables of reformist Communist Party leaders, representatives of the dissident movement and groups, and also experts. Poland is a somewhat difficult case, in my view, to put into this category, although it's often identified as a quintessential pacted transition in the communist world. It's difficult because one can't forget that, in fact, there was a very important mass dimension to the transition in Poland in two senses. One, in terms of the mass support for solidarity when it was resurrected at the behest of the regime, re-legalized in terms of members and supporters. And the second, in terms of the elections that were held in June, in which massive numbers of Poles participated, men and women, elections that gave the opposition solidarity candidates an overwhelming victory. They won every seat which they contested in the elections. So there was an important mass dimension, and in that sense, women also played a significant role in Poland. But if you look just at the roundtable representatives, you had an overwhelmingly male contingent on all sides. This despite the fact that women, in fact, had been active in dissent in both countries, particularly in Poland, where one has to remember that it was women who played a significant part in keeping solidarity alive during its period of illegality, and especially during martial law. Women, this is a role that's been very nicely documented by Shana Penn in a book, The Women of Solidarity. And it was also the firing of a woman worker, Anna Valentinovich, that really sparked the formation of solidarity in the first place. In the mass protests that brought about the end of communism in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Romania, women played a very significant role, both as protesters. They were out in the streets in massive numbers. This was true even in Romania, where, as you know, I'm sure, the forces loyal to the regime, the Securitate, fired on unarmed demonstrators. It was also true in the other two cases, particularly in what was then East Germany and in Czechoslovakia. Women also played, as they had in Poland, an important role in dissident circles. One of the spokespersons of Charter 77, which really I think merits the label of the longest lasting dissident organization in the region, one of the three spokespersons was always a woman. And in contrast to some of the other dissident groups throughout the region, the Charter actually had a pro-women orientation in its documents. It supported women's equality, right to work, etc., whereas some of the others took more, shall we say, traditional views. Women also emerged among the founders of the umbrella organizations that led the protests once they got started in these three countries, and they also played a role in the negotiations with the government. So this is their direct role in helping to bring about the transition. I'll say just 1 minute's worth about their indirect role, which is less appreciated. But to a large extent, this derives from the particular pattern of gender role change that occurred in the region, which left women, despite their assumption of roles in the paid labor force, primarily responsible for care of the home and children. And as a result, they were on the front lines in dealing with the inefficiencies of this system as it worked in this part of the world. And they also played a very important role in maintaining alternative values within the family, and this has been very well discussed. Let me move very quickly to women's roles in the so-called color revolutions, because here again, women played a very important role both as voters and as civil society activists. One of the spokespersons, in fact, the spokesperson in Slovakia was Lota Puflerova, an NGO leader, a woman. They also played somewhat of a role in forming the the opposition party coalitions that eventually won in these elections. Probably the most prominent example here is Yulia Tymoshenko in Ukraine. But they were also active in Serbia and in Slovakia, in Croatia, in Georgia, although perhaps less so in Georgia. Now, let me turn in the time I have left, 2 minutes, to the impact of all of this. What happened afterwards, which in many ways I think is the most interesting question for this group. Immediately afterwards, there was what I think can only be described as a backlash against the whole idea of gender equality. The number of women in public positions plummeted. It's the only word you can use. This wasn't as big a loss as it might have been thought to have been, because most of the women in official positions of power had no power under communism unless they were related to powerful men. But what was more problematic was the discrediting of the whole idea of gender equality. It was mainly politicians on the left and leaders of those old, almost defunct official women's organizations that brought up these issues, and it really was not a legitimate subject for public debate for a while. This has changed in the last, I would say, decade or so. It is now legitimate to raise issues concerning some of the unresolved aspects of women's situation. It's legitimate to raise issues about child care and what happens to children when public child care really decreases and factories no longer put any funds toward providing child care. So in many ways, it's once again possible to raise these issues. But there are still numerous obstacles, and the proportion of women in positions of political leadership has increased. We've had a few women prime ministers and presidents. That, in my view, is not as important as the slow but fairly steady increase in the number of women legislators. But there are still a great many obstacles for women in politics to pay attention to gender issues. We have some outside pressure that's focused attention on these issues, most specifically the Copenhagen criteria and the requirements for membership in the EU, but there are still a great many problems in this regard. I think I will not have time to discuss youth, but I can do that in the question and answer period if you like, because they were very significant actors in these events.
We'll do that in the second round.
Yes, thank you.
Susan,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And check my time as well. I want to thank the conference organizers for this wonderful event and for the invitation. This is an interesting time to think about Turkish youth this week, as we talked about yesterday. I want to say that at this point there's much to learn about what's going on in the streets of Istanbul and across Turkey. But what clearly we know is the youth are there and the women are there. And let's don't forget that many youth are women and many women are youth. So there's an overlap there. I want to talk about, I'll probably talk more about women than youth, but I do want us to consider some of the issues that both of those groups are having in today's society, and to remember that when we're talking about democracy, political participation, inclusion, that the two of those groups together form the majority of the Turkish population. So that's why the needs of these two groups need to be taken into account. Almost 43% of the Turkish population is 24 years of age and below. And one thing we've been hearing about the Arab Spring is how young those populations are across the region. Turkey, the average age in Turkey is 28.8 for males and 29.6 for females. It's still a bit older than Syria, where it's 22.3, Egypt 24.6, and it's about the same as Morocco and Tunisia. Unemployment is an issue shared by the youth, of course, across the region. For Turkish youth, actually unemployment has probably not been quite as bad as some of the other countries, but it went from, in 2009, 24.2% of Turkish youth were unemployed, and it's been on a decline since then, but just since the beginning of 2012 has been starting to rise. So, that could be kind of a background in terms of, part of what's sparking what's going on over there, in addition to some other issues. And one of the issues has been the cost of the economic development that we talked about a lot yesterday, so I won't go into it much, but the AK party, the party that would like to be called AK rather than AKP, has put into place are very much neoliberal reforms, and because of the types of requirements that have been placed on them by the IMF and the World Bank, EU, and other external players, it means that a lot of social rights have actually been undermined in Turkish society. And so youth and women are seeing the erosion of certain kinds of the welfare state that used to be there, and also retirement pensions and other things. So another thing to kind of keep in mind. The women's movement has been one of the most robust arenas of Turkish civil society in recent years. I've heard an international NGO representative say that and say how impressed he was at what they have been able to achieve. I'll talk a little bit about that. But feminism is far from new in Turkey. We can trace the beginning of the movement to the late 19th century Ottoman Empire. Educated women in Istanbul got together and organized an autonomous movement to push for a whole range of rights. And with the new Turkish Republic in 1923, it really kind of became usurped into a state feminism where Ataturk, as you know, let's say, he claimed to be liberating women, but what happened actually, and women got their voting rights in 1934, which was before some European countries, very much a top-down opening for women's rights under the secular Turkish Republic, but it didn't establish open public spaces for feminist organizing, and it didn't really challenge this idealized sphere of the home for women as participants in building the republic. So limits on what that was able to achieve. Jump forward to 1980s, we see a lot of identity-based movements that are growing in Turkey as well as other places in the world, and the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movement, and other identity-based movements are starting to organize at that time, but also some Islamist movements. So you also see the beginning of some culture wars coming out of that time that we are still seeing today. I want to mention some of the sort of the international relationships. We were talking about external interventions last time. One is that Turkey has signed quite a number of these external conventions that relate to gender. One is the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Types of Discrimination Against Women. Most recently, something called the Istanbul Convention, which was passed in 2011, and it's called that. It's actually the European Convention on Elimination of Violence Against Women, and it's called that because it was signed in Turkey. It has been ratified by Turkey and 3 other countries. It will not go into force until 10 states have ratified it, but it is a convention that a lot of Turkish women's organizations work very hard to actually push through, and there was a battle over a number of things with the government, including some clauses about marital rape, etc., until finally it was kind of held hostage by the EU or the Council of Europe and said, negotiations will not go forward unless you sign this, and so it was signed. Also, the coalitions of women's organizations, including especially the women lawyers, helped put together a major change in the penal code back in 2004. There were other battles with the government over that, but that also sort of was part of the negotiation with EU membership. There has recently been a domestic violence law that was passed in 2012, and kind of trying to change a lot of the sort of the standard laws having to do with domestic violence and other things. Now, I want to mention that there is backlash to some of this, so we won't go into too much. But for example, the 2011 Istanbul Convention, there's a man's group, men and boys group that's saying, this is really dangerous. It's Soviet, it's socialist, it's top-down feminism, and it's going to hurt men. So again, part of the culture wars. I want to kind of contextualize some of this by thinking about the way that social movement theorists talk about something called the boomerang effect, which is that often when groups such as activist organizations that don't have a lot of power necessarily within their society are looking to outside external networks, as well as things like these treaties and conventions, to help push their cause forward. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing that's going on, where often these women's groups are looking to external support, external intervention, especially with activist networks, and very much welcoming those, especially when they're feeling in less positions of power within their current situation. There have been a number of battles with the current government over certain issues, like the change in the name of the Ministry of Women and Family Affairs to Family Affairs, and so these feelings that the current government is backing down on some of its commitments to women's issues in the society. 2 minutes, well, okay, so briefly I will just talk about youth a little bit. Well, let me just say that I think that one of the things to think about in terms of these international relationships is the fact that young women, especially, I think, are going to be, because they're so internationally connected, I think are going to be less of the type of group that's going to sort of call international interventions cultural imperialism. That's kind of a prediction. I don't know if it's true or not. But in terms of lessons for the Middle East and for what's going on in the MENA countries, one of the things is also to remember that Egypt and the other Middle Eastern countries have their own histories also of feminism dating way back to the same time, our country did. And so there's already an indigenous history there. There's also a similar history of state feminism, of the state, modern state, using women's issues as a way to modernize, right, part of the modernization project, which gets co-opted. So that there's a kind of a shared history there that I think we can look at. And yet, I want to also say that there is, I think we have to be careful about these external interventions. I've been reading about the Balkans, and when all of these high-level NGOs and international non-governmental organizations came in with their plans for gender equality, even though a lot of it was welcome, the donor money was welcome, there were also, there was some cynicism over this helicoptering in, and, seeing that a lot of these organizations really didn't have gender equality in their own structures. And so, sort of, again, mixed messages, as we were talking about last time. So, 2 seconds, or that's it? Oh, okay, I just wanted to add one little thing that I'm going to say something positive, which is I will be going next month to teach a social movements class in Istanbul, and it is part of a program for the Open Society Foundations, which is basically gives scholarships to students, international students, to study in the West and go back. And there's a program that really doesn't get a lot of attention, but I think it's very important, called the Palestinian Rule of Law program, where the students go, the young people, and including a lot of women, get these degrees, LLM in the West, in the States, or somewhere else, and then they go back to help put judicial institutions into place into their societies. And since the Arab Spring, that is including all the Middle Eastern countries. It's called the MIRO program now. And so I think higher education needs to be part of this discussion as this kind of indirect soft power that we have And that's it.
Thank you very much. Sharon, would you like to speak for 5 minutes about the youth, or do you want to use it in your answers?
I can do whatever's.
And then
we're
we
still
go.
waiting for
Yeah.
our panelists.
One way or the other, I think after your 5 minutes, we go to Lubna and ask her to comment, because our third speaker may come, may not come. So let's start
So
with
I'll
5.
take
Yeah,
5
the
minutes in that
and
case.
then Lubna, you please have the floor.
Yeah,
You
thank
wait.
No, no,
No,
I'll
go.
be. What academic wouldn't take 5 extra minutes? Okay, youth. This is clearly one of the better known aspects of the fall of communism, I think, and especially of the so-called color revolutions. And if you look at it, you can see the role of students in many of these countries, but again, especially in those that fell suddenly as the result of mass activism. I was struck in Prague in my first visit after 1989, March of 1990, by signs on the philosophy faculty, graffiti. And one of them, I think, really captured the role of students. It said, "We children of 68 have statečný," which in Czech is hard to translate, but it's something like worthwhile, well brought up, something like this. Children, right? Linking the activism of students in 1989 to their parents' generation and support for the reform of 1968. And students did play an important role, because in these more repressive communist systems, you couldn't rely on the official media to report the events. And just to take the case of Czechoslovakia as an example, it was students who took news of the early demonstrations in Prague out to the provincial towns and villages and helped to spread word about the revolution. So they were very actively involved, and early on there were student committees that played a role with Civic Forum and Public Against Violence and so on. And if we turn to the so-called electoral or color revolutions, I think this is probably one of the elements of them that's best known, the role of Otpor, for example, the young students in Serbia who formed an organization in 1997 that played such a critical role in convincing their elders to form a united opposition coalition and to mobilize support both for the election and then for the protests. There were similar groups in Croatia and in Slovakia, which Val Bunce and I see as the origin of this movement, this method of electoral change. In fact, there was not a specific organization, but the campaign itself to oust Mečiar, the OK 98 campaign, was directed very specifically at first-time voters, youth. 80% of whom eventually did vote, because the NGO and think tank communities knew through public opinion polling that those voters would not vote for Mečiar. So they used techniques borrowed from Rock the Vote in the US, heavy use of rock concerts, cultural figures, public events to mobilize young people, and they were very important. Para in Ukraine and so on, again, very critical roles in getting out the vote and helping with the mass demonstrations where these occurred. Now, here again, I think the interesting question is, what happens to youth afterwards? Well, the short answer is that they grow up, right? And in that process, I'm still hoping my youth in my family will grow up. But they grow up and they move on to their careers, or they go back and finish their educations, etc. A few of them, such as the Otpor boys in Serbia, have made, in effect, a career out of helping to support nonviolent movements for change around the world, and some of them were active in the Middle East, specifically with the April 6th movement activists, and they, in fact, even helped with that election that brought a democratically elected president into office in the Maldives. They were actually given an island where they were supposed to set up a democracy campus. Well, he was soon deposed, so that's gone down the drain. But they continue to be active in this respect. Others went into politics as usual, and some of them actually made careers here. Again, I'm thinking of Alexander Vondra, who was a young student who came to the U.S. with Havel at his first visit and then went on to a career that eventually brought him back to Washington as Czech ambassador to the U.S. But the majority of them did what all young people do, right? They started families and they focused on their careers. There was an interesting effort in the Czech Republic again, 10 years after the revolution. On the anniversary of these events, the nonviolent demonstrations that the police broke up brutally, a group of students organized a demonstration that came to be known as "Thank You, Now Leave." Right? And their message to the older generation was, you've had 10 years to deal with this, and you've done your part. We respect you. We appreciate it. It's time for you to leave the scene. As many people expected, including their elders, this movement fizzled. They tried to create some kind of a nonpartisan political movement. Some of them tried to turn part of the movement into a political party. So did Otpor in Serbia, by the way, but it really didn't last. So I don't know what that says about youth in the Middle East and North Africa, but I guess I would conclude that these traces of activism, it's an interesting question to think about how participating in these events affects people down the road, not directly, but indirectly, just as those children of 68. We wonder what impact the children of 89 have had on their children and on the political values of that generation.
Thank you very much. Lubna, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these excellent presentations. I am giving my comments as a Moroccan student of women's movement, participant and observer with a strong historical perspective. In saying this, what I mean is that when we keep the historical perspective, two things are no longer surprising. One, it's not surprising that women and youth have participated or are leaders at the forefront of the Arab Spring. As you have said in the presentations, indeed the region has a long history of women involved in the historical, social, economic involvement in their countries. But of course the context is different, and I'm gonna go back to that. So there is a long history, and actually the women and youth today in the Middle East and North Africa are learning from that history too. So while they are keeping an eye on what is happening in other transitions in other parts of the world, women are learning from the fact that after the wars of independence, where women participated, many of them were left with very little in the post-independence era. So this is a déjà vu, but within a different context that really problematizes, where women stand. Two, what we learn with that historical perspective is that transitions are typically not gender-friendly. There is nothing new about that. Not only are they not gender-friendly, but they're actually violent to women. And we haven't talked about gender-based violence. And that's what we have seen in various squares called, ironically, liberation squares. And what that tells us is what Sharon talked about in terms of backlash. And I'd like to broaden the meaning of backlash as much as we can so that we put under backlash what happens in terms of gender-based violence that emerges from unresolved tensions prior to the revolutions, as well as problems and concerns that emerge with the transitions. I would like to put under backlash also what happens when external players use terms like feminism and empowerment, gender empowerment. I would like to use backlash even for young people. Few years ago, we would not have had a panel including youth. In the MESA conference, the Middle East Conference of Africa, North America, I remain African. A few years ago, I was an oddity speaking about youth. It's heartwarming to realize now that we do have special panels on young people. So I am elated too to see we're talking about women, we're talking about youth, but I would have loved to see 2 different sessions. Not because these are not connected, not because women are youth and youth are women, but because there is more to it. Because there is an issue that we are not fully talking about, which is generational shifts. Are there generational shifts? What do they mean in the region? So I said the context is different. Indeed it is. The global context is different. The global context is different because the global context is simultaneously empowering as well as disempowering women and young people. The global context, so we do have, the technologies enabling a faster diffusion of progressive but also regressive ideas. And the local context is also interesting and dynamic. So we do have multiple femininities, multiple currents of feminisms, multiple trends of youth activisms. We have femininities and masculinities that are both hegemonic. We have hegemonic femininities. We need to be able to talk about that are not allowing us to make progress. And we do have progressive masculinities that we need to be able to work with. So the context, as I pull it, is some of it is traditional, some of it is re-traditionalizing gender norms, and some of it is modernizing. And I'm not too warm about the concept of postmodernizing, but just to give you multiple temporalities that exist simultaneously in the region. So with that, I'm going to focus on just 5 quick conclusions in responses. I'm putting both papers and responding to them. I'm in dialogue with you, as opposed to specifically responding to every point. So the first point is, I don't think that we should be wasting time making a case for women are visible and participant in revolutions. We don't have to make that case. They are visible. They always have been. The important question is, in what ways does their participation transform the meaning and outcome of democratization and transitional processes? In what ways? At what levels? Because we know, and you have said it in both papers, that they do actually participate directly, indirectly, at various levels, at home, outside. They do all of these things. But what is something that I'd like to raise here is that as much as feminist scholarship deals with intersectionality and post-colonialism, which are extremely important in the case of the Middle East and North Africa, I don't see the literature on democratization engaging as much with feminist scholarship. And I'm wondering, what would our panels look like if we mainstreamed gender and youth concerns? What does it mean to put a gender lens on constitutional writing? What are the tensions? What are the outcomes? What are the gains? What does it mean when we put the gender lens and the youth lens when we are talking about the articulation of external players and the rising and emergence of new players? These are questions. And in the literature on women democratization in Latin America, there is now a tendency to talk about male democracy, how to get away from male democracy. Number 2, women's participation and democratization are interactive processes, complex, but interactive. In many ways, women's participation may and does help consolidate democratic practices and institutions. And yet, we find a dominant assumption still that we need to first democratize and then engender. We've heard that on Tahrir Square. We've noticing it actually in much of the discussion that came up recently. Came up, on transitions. So we need to consolidate, to establish democratic practices, and then think about how we can bring in women. And that is really a very problematic approach. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we not fall in the trap of sequentialism? And actually, Middle Eastern women and North African women are not falling in the trap. They saw that in the 50s and 60s with their wars of independence. So in many ways, and we've mentioned this yesterday, about democracy exists simultaneously with inequality. We haven't talked about race, and we have not talked about inequality in terms of ethnicity and tribal differences. So the gender and the age factor are very important pieces to bring to discussion to complicate transitions to democracy. And that takes me to the next point, which is how to avoid the risks of political isolation for women. So when there is so much backlash, women tend to withdraw from formal politics, or they push for formal politics, but nonetheless, we have the impression that there are various political paths taking place. They don't intersect, and they should. But there are risks, as everything else, and there are gains. And some of the risks is how to be part of mainstream politics without being absorbed by it and co-opted. And we're seeing some of that in the prior generation. Some of that, my country included. So that takes me to the next point for the sake of wrapping up. Of course, women do not act as a bloc, nor do youth. What brings them together, women and youth, what has brought them together, is fighting against authoritarianism. But democratic transitions are separating them again, as we are witnessing in most countries. And so it is harder to organize all the feminisms we have in our region to work towards democratic transitions. And it is harder, despite all the efforts of young people, to come together in the post-revolutionary transitions in some cases. There are wonderful initiatives taking place. But there are important things also happening simultaneously. We are seeing, and Margot Badran was talked earlier on about the emergence of new feminism. And I focus in my research on generational tensions and renewal of leadership. In fact, even within women's movements, those tensions, from my interviews around the region, fascinating dynamics are taking place. And I think we should be able to pay attention to that. And I will conclude with the final point, and that is a trend that seems to be a little bit in the transitions in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and I'm seeing some of it. I'm just beginning the research, so I am not speaking here as an authority, but I'm throwing this as a discussion, which is the rejection of politics. There is consensus that politics is a dirty game. We hear that from women, we hear that from young people, and that's when we start asking the question, so what's the outcome? What happens when all of these young people and all of these women are participating? Where is this leading them? And so on the one hand, there is a self-conscious decision not to get involved in politics. Mm-hmm. So what are they involved in other than carrying on with their lives and getting married? And they do increasingly we talk about community community engagement. So the question is there really rejection of politics or transformation of political engagement? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. We're very happy that Luciana Serrao Sampaio joined us, and you have the floor for 10 minutes, please.
First and foremost, I'd like to apologize. I went to the wrong venue. I went to the American University. It was not lack of respect to any of you. The cut that I'm gonna make in my presentation is from 1960s in Brazil to 1985 in Brazil. Why I chose that time, this is not due to the fact that feminism just appeared then. Actually, we have records that feminism goes back to mid-19th century in Brazil. But the idea is that the contemporary feminism was brought about in Brazil during the dictatorship. This may sound weird, and I will explain why. The 1960s, as in most countries, was a very specific moment in Brazil. We range from a democratic government with a president who renounces. Then we have a parliamentary system. Then we have back to the presidentialism. Then we have the dictatorship, which takes over. And in those 20 years of dictatorship, we had 5 presidents. And then there is a distinction towards democracy again. In those 20 years, again, we go back to we have the economic miracle in Brazil, and then you have the hyperinflation, and then you have the loss of trust of the population on what the dictatorship was doing in the country. The give and take at the moment was, okay, I agree with the dictatorship as long as you end corruption and you bring development to the country. At the moment that development is not moving forward, the trust of that government starts to erode. At the same time, it is in the beginning, in the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, that we see greater participation of Brazilian women as a whole. They're not necessarily avant-garde. They can be just housewives or ladies of the house who had ideas and were in the public context. And you also had the young intellectuals that were going to university and were thinking, well, the order that we have is no longer what we want to have. Then you have the contraceptive pill, which also represented a major change in behavior in Brazil. So all those elements combined to give you a reflection of what was the country living at that moment. Once the democratic process was ruptured in Brazil, then what we have is that all those groups who were in the public eye demanding for expression, they tend to rebel against the government. So what you have the armed rebellion and you have the pacific rebellion. So what does it mean to women? Did women participate in that movement? They participated in both. They participated as a counterforce to, they participated as a support for the dictatorship movement. And they also participated in the rebel movement, including in the armed rebel movement. So we today benefit from the fact that we have the recounts of those women who participated in the movement, both the Pacific one and the armed one, telling us what were their perceptions 10 years later. So what they say is the rebel movements, the armed specific ones, they were, although the rhetoric was the equal opportunity between men and women, for a fact what they realized was that when it came to strategy, when it came to analysis, when it also led to action, they were excluded. They had a supporting role. So they would be in the corner with a boyfriend watching the operation and seeing if the bank robbery was going to suffer because there was a police car or because the escape car was taken. They were not really, they claim, according to the historical documents, that they were not really in the front lines. right? Of course, there are exceptions. But then those women who say, well, we were in the front lines, they say we had to adopt a masculine attitude, be it towards arms, be it towards our relationship. It's a very interesting process. You may wonder how many women actually took part in that. So from those, and that's the funny part, we don't have accurate numbers of who belonged to the rebel movement or not, for obvious reasons. But then the dictatorship with the files of who were in prison, who was tortured, who died, then we can have a recollection of those people. So we have about 4,300 people who were object of prosecution during those 20 years. From those 4,300, 84% were men. The rest, 16%, were women. Most of them in regards to armed rebellion. They represented 18% in urban movements, and a little bit less in rural. The difference between the two is that they said the urban would take into account only the syndicates and the students and the youth, while the rural was trying to have the distribution of land to the working rural people who did not have land, and they were oppressed by the landowners. So you have those two movements working together. As the dictatorship started to fall for the criticisms of society, and repression got to a point that people no longer tolerated, what they have is a small process of liberation. So some of the prisoners were sent to asylum. Some of the prisoners were exchanged for the ambassadors who were kidnapped at the time. So you have this diaspora of the rebel community who was sent abroad. Those women who were sent abroad, they had a large contact with feminism in Europe mainly. So they absorbed those ideas. On the other hand, those women who were involved in a Pacific movement of resistance in Brazil, they started to search for other groups who were facing the same difficulties that they were, other women. Where did they find those women? They found those women in the periphery, in the lower income areas of Brazil, who were being organized by the progressive section of the Catholic Church in Brazil. So you may find it weird that you have the Catholic Church, which is usually a symbol of conservatism, being aligned to the rebel and clandestine activities of women. What we see is from those demands of the union of those two groups, you don't have a genuine feminist agenda. The feminist groups, they were willing to give away their main agenda, be it sexuality, be it equal opportunity, equal pay, and all those access to better education. They were willing to give away to that in order to unify with the women from the periphery and have a movement that was being consolidated. So they absorbed in the feminist agenda, this is the 1970s, they absorbed the periphery, the request for infrastructure, the request for sewage, for housing, for energy, security. This is not what you would call a genuine agenda for feminism, but that what was possible at the time. 1975, when there is the UN Convention for Women, that was, the UN International Year for Women, that was a defining moment in Brazil, because then the government was faced with the fact that they had to discuss women. So that clandestine movement that was based on the periphery of the country, was brought forward. And that became part of the political agenda of the country, with events taking place, such as 1978, 1979, 1980. There were conventions on women taking place in Brazil, some smaller ones, like 80 people, then 800 people, and then 4,000 people. And as you can see, when you bring together a group of intellectuals and a group of people that they have very clear demands that is related to their day-to-day life and not necessarily with major ideas that do not interfere consciously in their day-to-day, you're bound to have disagreement and conflict. During also this time, in 1979, we had the amnesty law in Brazil, which allowed for those women who were in Europe to come back to Brazil and then get together with the proper feminist movement in Brazil. So what you see from the combination of the people from exile, the intellectuals that directed the feminist movement in Brazil, together with the base movement, the periphery movement, you have a fragmentation of the movement, because you have those who are willing just to demand for their better social conditions. There were those that were demanding public space, and there were those who really wanted to reflect on the position of women in society. What was their role? With the progress of democracy in Brazil, although the movement became fragmented, it created room for those diverse areas constitute themselves as powerful groups. So you do have a group of, I'm about to finish. There was a group of women working at the universities, producing knowledge, and then one last note, the feminist movement went to gender movement. So there was a broadening of the concept of what their concerns were. And then you have a greater realm for women in public policy, which was recognized. And then you have the creation of the centers for the National Centers for the Defense of Women. And it is progressive, and not all of it is perfect, but you can see that the feminist agenda, or the gender agenda, as you prefer, became part of the day-to-day political life of Brazil.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I open the floor, I would like to turn to all the panelists to see whether you would like to comment on each other, what they said, or you have a question, or you want to make a point, because Lubna made 5 points, and she said she would like it as a dialogue rather than, commenting. So who wants to go?
Sure. Go ahead. Okay, I'll start. Thank you so much. A lot to think about, and I don't think there's time to respond to everything. I'll say that I do talk about some of these in the 15-minute version of my paper, but I'll just mention as race and ethnicity, for example, intersectionality. That's definitely an issue, and there's a Kurdish women's movement in southeast Turkey that's very active and doing a lot of actual, very much grassroots work and empowerment and in training them to become entrepreneurs, for example, and especially related to this question that came up yesterday about democratic participation, having a strong civil society, for example. Democracy needs, these organized groups. And I think we're all thinking back to after 1989 when, so many people went into Eastern Europe sort of armed with all of this Tocquevillian, philosophy of, America knows, how to do this because we have this great, rich associational life. But I just want to remind us that yes, we have, strong women's associations, African American activism, et cetera. But, and Martin Luther King was able to also use, the sort of the normative philosophy within our own documents, right? And he was able to use legal instruments like the boycott, to actually, help democratize us further. But he had to lose his life. Alice Paul almost lost her life in prison on a hunger strike, trying to get suffrage for women. And so I guess one lesson is that we didn't get it right in the beginning, and that's why we had to have all of these groups. So I guess it goes back to your point as how can we start there rather than, say, let's put the Constitution in place, et cetera, and then let's add all of these great sort of social movements and institutionalized civil society to that. So,
of course, in the region now, especially in the countries that went through the Arab Spring, the question is, how do we preserve the rights that we have been gaining
Right,
all
right.
these years? I
Exactly.
mean, you
Not
know,
go
I mean,
backwards,
it's
yeah.
not even going beyond what they have. I mean, you know, at this stage, what do we do not to lose this point?
Right,
You know,
yeah.
That's the big issue.
Yeah, and I also remember, and you probably do too, know some women who went over to Eastern Europe saying, you know, right after 1989, you've got to get gender equality into your constitutions because we still can't get it here. So, and we still don't have it. So.
Right, and what they said in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, was that we had gender equality in the Constitution, and it didn't do any good, right? Or it didn't do as
In the
much
older-
good as
older
it
Constitution, yeah.
should have been. I have just a couple of observations also, and one is the issue of violence, I think is a critical one in looking at backlash, and I didn't talk about that at all. I also didn't talk about in the post-communist region the sort of one glaringly violent transition, which was the wars in former Yugoslavia.
Mhm.
And that's another whole subject, and it's just kind of too much to get into in thinking about gender issues, but there you have it with the use of rape as a weapon of war, et cetera, in the Yugoslav case. So it's a critical issue, clearly. I wanted to just say about looking at gender and democratization. I mean, I think there has, especially maybe in the Latin American cases, been a lot of work on that dimension. Jane Jacquet has been working on that for years and years. We did an edited volume some time ago looking at those issues in Latin America and Central and Eastern Europe, and the whole question of male democracy and what to do with it, I think is one that continues to engage people very usefully. In terms of the issue of rejection of politics and or is it transformation of political engagement? From the region I know best, there is some evidence of that in the sense that women, but it's also true of men, tend to be more active, more likely to be members of NGOs than they do of political parties. They have a somewhat higher view of NGOs than they do of political parties, not much, but somewhat. But the real problem there, I think, is the position of the NGOs, right? And again, you can have women dominate the NGO sector, but if it's, quote, real politics that dominates the financial, the economic decisions of the country, then, and there are few links between NGOs and political decision makers, which in much of the region that is true because that's why people went into the NGO sector. They agreed with even some of the former dissidents that politics was a dirty business and that women didn't have to dirty their hands with it, but just in general that it was not to be engaged in by honest people. Then you have this real disconnect between areas where women are active and where the power to make decisions is. And I think that's a problem. The sequentialism, absolutely. Those arguments were made in Central Europe. They were made by those some of the charter dissidents that I've held up as, proponents of gender equality. They were made even by women who were very active in politics. Rita Klimova, who was spokesperson for Civic Forum and later ambassador here, once said publicly that feminism could only be, quote, a flower on the cloak of democracy. Right? I think that's a sort of more poetic way of saying we'll get to that later. Right? First we have to build democracy. So I thought it was a good point. Thanks.
My experience with the Iranian Revolution and then the uprising in 2009 was that gender issues and women's rights was never raised because the women who took part very actively in the revolution and in 2009 were told that we will come to that. Let the revolution succeed. At this stage, let's not introduce, especially when you are working for an Islamic revolution, let's not introduce the concept of equal right. But once we succeed, we will then take care of it. And of course, women have been waiting, at least in Iran, for 33 years for this issue to be put on the table. And among the presidential candidates who are running, so far, every single one of them has been trying to avoid bringing up women's issues. And the one person who is the front runner, Jalili, who talked about it, he addressed a group of women, said, the best service a woman can do to her country is to be a good mother. So, I mean, that's really turning the clock back. Shall I open? Yes, please, the lady here. Yeah. Do we have a mic or just? Yes. Wait for the mic and identify yourself, please. Sure.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I have several questions, so I will try to be brief as possible. About this, the time limit on youth activism, the fact that they're growing up. How do you think technology affects that? Can technology, by providing multiplicity of instruments, prolong that activism by making it easier? Because you sit down, before a computer, and when you tweet, you're also in politics. So, does it help, or does it change that, or prolong youth activism? Although they become 35 years old, they can still, be active somehow. I also want to underline the aspect of violence. I'm sure Susan has a lot to say about this, but in Turkey as well, over the last 10 years, there has been substantial increase in violence against women, and most of those women, and the numbers are incredible. Since 2002, we have seen an increase of 1,400% in murder of women. And they're mostly killed by their husbands, their fathers, brothers, or someone in their family. And 1/3 of them are actually killed during or after a divorce case. So that means that there's a backlash to an increasing trend in divorce cases that are filed by women, and men are not adjusting to that, apparently. There is an increasing debate within the feminist movements in Turkey. Some of them blame this on the conservative nature of the government, which I think is an important part of the problem. But there is also an unintended consequence of economic empowerment that the government allowed or provided thanks to economic stability and decreasing inflation since 2002. So women are more confident than ever that they can actually run a house pretty much on their own salaries, and they don't necessarily need to say okay to their husbands who have been beating them for several years now. So increasing rates of divorce and the fact that men are unable to adjust to this changing understanding or confidence in women is also playing an important part, and I don't really think that the government is also able to appreciate that fact.
Thank you. I think we'll get back to you. Just 2 questions, and then
Just
no,
one
I'm
last
sorry.
point about
I really
sequentialism.
would like to get
Okay,
back
all right,
to you.
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the gentleman there.
Okay, just would like to address Luciana, I'm sorry, because you stopped in an early stage of the history of feminism, and there was a lot of things move on after 1988. So just 2 questions. First, one, the decision during the Cardozo and capped during the Lula to make all the social policies oriented and anchor in women, and how this affect the role of women in families and their power within the community. What is your reaction to that? Second, what is your reaction to women in real politics, being president of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, how this is changing the environment in Latin America?
Okay, let's start with Luciana.
Okay.
And then we move to answering the 2 questions. Okay, please.
I think that the Constitution of 1988 had a defining moment there. At the moment that before, women was subject of the husband. The Constitution of 1988 established the equality between the two. So we also, I didn't mention, but it's fantastic to realize that the divorce law in Brazil is from 1979. You know, so all that discussion that the women can take care of the house and the women are able to be the breadwinner of the house, there is a history of that in Brazil right now. And it's funny to realize also that the court system, I know I'm in a digression a little bit, but I'll get to the point. The court system now in Brazil are reviewing the allowance money that they give to the woman, saying, to the extent that they have a kid, and the kid has to be supported by both, then she receives the allowance money. Otherwise, if the woman had no harm to the standing of her professional life due to the fact that she married, the judge is not inclined at all to give that kind of money. The essence of the policies, the public policies that were put in place since Cardoso and also adopted by Lula, you see that what is realized is that the person who takes care of the child is the woman. The man has one relationship, they're gonna move to the other one and have kids with all of them. And when they want to, if they don't want to give the allowance money, they will not. Well, there is, you can go to the court system, it is expensive. If you're talking to most of the women, they will not have the resources or the ability to find a lawyer to go after her husband to pay that what is due. You know, this kind of resource of going to court is more viable to middle-income families. So there are some fantastic examples of basing the policies on women. For example, in Brasilia, where there was a distribution of land for families who were living in Brasilia for 10 years. The mother received not the title, but the cession of using of the land. Supposedly, they would not sell it. With time, what we realize is that there is the concession of the cession of the land to someone else with a pay. But it goes back to the main issue, which is the women is being ahead of the family. The women are taking care of the family. So the state should recognize the role that they have and facilitate their lives. Also, it's not just about giving assistance to the women. It's also about creating obligations to the women with demanding a certain amount of attendance to schools, demanding going until a certain age, attending a health center. So there are those compensations that women are offering to the state, guaranteeing that at some point, those kids, they will have a better chance in life than the mother had. In regards to women in politics, let's put it this way, I'm a professional diplomat. I'm here in an academic context, so whatever I say, it's my own fault. I do find the 2010 electoral process fascinating. Not necessarily because President Dilma won, but because there was a person like Marina Silva who won, who participated. She was the third in place. She got 19% of the vote, circa 19.3% of the votes. That represented 19 million votes. And can be said that Dilma was elected due to association of image of herself with President Lula, which is true. A lot of people didn't know who she were at the time, and now, you know, she's the president. I think that more than President Dilma, Marina Silva, she had a fundamental importance in that process for women in general. She was illiterate until the age of 17. She became a senator of the Republic. She became an environmental minister in the country. So I don't think that she didn't need anyone else to consecrate her presence in politics. Her personal history is a symbol of where the country is leading us to. You know, That being said, we have a law that says that for every 3 men, there must be a woman candidate in the electoral process in Brazil. There are a lot of phony candidacies going on, you know? Yeah, they need to have women. They must have women in the legend, which doesn't mean that the parties are investing in the presence of women in public life. But I also think that women are not asking for the acceptance of their presence. Those who are really engaged, they are going to make room for themselves. There is opportunity, I think. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay.
Thank you. So now the first question, who's going to start?
Technology. Well, I'm having a little bit of trouble thinking about this in terms of my cases because the technology wasn't as ubiquitous, right? It played some role in Ukraine, certainly, cell phones mainly, but to some extent they had an internet magazine. There was some communication on the internet. So it's a little harder to think of how people that were directly involved in 1989 might be using that. I will say that despite my somewhat, I suppose, optimistic comments about the impact of participation in these events on people later, if you look at public opinion surveys in the region, young people are not uniformly, as you might expect, more supportive of democracy, less cynical about politics, less collectivist and more individualist in their orientations in terms of taking responsibility for their own welfare as opposed to looking at the state. They're not. To some degree, their attitudes vary by education and rural as opposed to urban as opposed to rural, all those expected variables. But that's one that kind of surprised me when I looked at those studies. And what I see looking at, let's take the Ukrainian case, young people who were very involved in 2004, is that they are now very disillusioned, along with older people. Everyone is disillusioned with the results of the Orange Revolution. But what I heard again and again a few years ago was, we don't have any leaders. Are you still engaged in politics? Well, we're not going to do a mass campaign because there's no one to support. They're all crooked on all sides and so on. So that doesn't bode well for later engagement.
Anybody else on the issue of violence against women?
Yes, could I also briefly talk about the technology? One is, well, I'm remembering Lech Wałęsa being asked something about the success of the Solidarity movement, and he points to a television. So, I think there was some technology involved. It was just different. Whenever I ask my students about, why it is youth populate social movements, I mean, it's really easy for them to just tick off a list. Well, they don't have any kind of adult responsibilities. If they're arrested, they're not going to lose their job. I mean, they're listening to all these idealistic professors. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which it makes sense for that population to be leading the movements, right? It's kind of less of a cost to them. And the question of whether technology might keep them more active, I'm reminded of a guy who was involved in the Moldovan Twitter revolution, and there was this critique that it was just kind of like and click, and that was all you were doing, and you weren't really out in the streets. And I was just looking at Charles Tilley's book on social movements, where he talks about how, street demonstrations and being out in the street protests are still extremely effective and necessary, and they're very much part of the movement. So I guess my question is, once they take on those adult responsibilities and can't be out on the streets anymore, what happens to that activism? And also Tilley says, social movements could disappear or actually morph into some other type of political work. So
one point that does come to mind, though, a case we haven't discussed, or at least I don't know if you discussed this morning, but so far at all, Russia, where, remember, the post-December 2011 demonstrations, those were largely middle-class, approaching middle-aged people out in the streets. So it doesn't always work that way.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, exactly. You're right. And then violence against women, yes, and I've heard that statistic, and it's very sobering. A couple of things. One is I know that there are a number of the women's organizations in Turkey that are real sensitive about the term honor crimes and feel that a lot of Europeans and European feminists are kind of seeing that as something exotic, and they're kind of honing in on that, and it kind of makes them a little bit sensitive, right, to that particular problem. But let me just say something about that. One of the things that was in this 2004 law that was passed, basically, in order to get the penal code up to European standards, they had to have gender equality in the penal code. Well, you probably know this history, and so that meant that if you violated the honor and then were killed, if you were a woman who was killed versus a man who was killed, the punishments of the murderer were now equal, where before you got a light punishment if a woman was killed. And so because of that, what's happened is that a lot of families are now pressuring their daughters to commit suicide so they won't be punished to the extent that they used to be. Also, another issue that you're probably familiar with is that a young woman who gets pregnant and then, of course, is killed for getting pregnant. Often that's because of incest in the family. It's not because she was running around with a boyfriend. So, another thing to keep in mind. In terms of divorce cases, I think. Yeah, you're right. It might have to do with that economic independence that's going on, but also in our country, violence against women increases when you leave the violent relationship. You're more likely to be murdered when you try to leave the violent relationship. So that might be something kind of, internationally universal. And I also want to mention LGBT movements because there is an overlap here, an intersection we haven't had time to talk about. And if we had more time, I could get into it. There's a lot of collaboration between the gay and lesbian movements in Turkey and the women's movement, and they helped get some of these conventions and laws in place. And just an example of that intersection was a horrible case last summer where a transsexual woman was violently, brutally murdered by her husband. So it's both maybe we could call it a homophobic crime and an act of domestic violence. So that intersection is there, violence against a woman. So I'll pass it on. Yeah.
Very quickly, really, because I want to leave time for more questions. But I want to reflect on two things. One is on this question of technology and whether it extends the time for engagement. And technology has a number of is used in a number of ways, and it's sort of impacting young people's and old people's activism in a number of ways beyond clicktism. I mean, they do online, offline, there is a sort of flexibility, but that's not what I want to talk about. I think that it's in the transition period that you really start seeing that gender matters. And it matters because how a young male can transition and take all of those responsibilities of a job, and starting a family, and how a young woman would do that, that's when you start seeing traditional expectations kicking in with force, and then suddenly political engagement for women would mean going beyond the norms of motherhood, that house, those responsibilities, that, additional, sort of sacrifices that, that have to be made. So that's where you start seeing, the sort of entrenched patriarchal, norms that are really hindering in an invisible way, but they are real. I mean, they are there. But I want to go back again to this point of economic empowerment and violence. I think that is, very, very important in, societies, like, in the Middle East and North Africa, where there is very little return to begin with on investment in education for women. Right, so the involvement in the labor market, at least the sort of formal is still very low. But I think we are seeing some really interesting studies on the sort of connections between economic empowerment, changing masculinities as well as femininities, and the sort of violences that emerge from empowered women with increasing unemployment for men, although when you look at the statistics, whatever they mean and however we produce them, in our countries, you realize that women are, the numbers are fewer in the labor market, but when it comes to unemployment, you always see, a spike in how women are employed. But there is something very interesting to look at there in terms of economics, cultural, and social shifts as well in how, femininities and masculinities are lived and experienced.
Luciana, you want to add something on violence against
women? I think that in Brazil, I don't know if you're familiar with, but in 1985, it was created the first police unit dedicated to violence against women. And then the criticism at the time was you are criminalizing something that has a very social nature. The next step was to create the special justice courts. The idea was you're gonna give agility, and you're gonna have people who will be correctly prepared for that. That was in the 90s. Once again, this did not solve the problem, because those special criminal courts, the idea was to reconcile the couples, not address the problems. And then in 2000, we faced a criminal charge before the Inter-American Human Rights Court, because there was a lady. She was divorced, just like she said before. She divorced from her husband. Her husband twice tried to kill her, but in the last time he left her disabled. She tried to bring charges to him in Brazil, and those charges were never went through. That's why, together with NGOs, she went to the Inter-American System of Human Rights. The Inter-American System started pressuring Brazil, saying not only you have to bring charges against this man, but you must also have a law who addresses all the concerns for domestic violence. In that sense, what you have was a law who started to foresee protective measures for women, a place where they could go and be protected, and different crimes due to domestic violence. That law is called Maria da Penha. It has not been completely enacted. There is a system with NGOs who monitor the implementation of the law. And even so, having all that being said, what we realize in Brazil is that domestic violence is still a problem. The state doesn't know all the answers. And we've been trying to address it, sometimes more forcefully and sometimes more reluctantly. And but Maria da Penha has become a hallmark in the matter of domestic violence. I think that covers it.
Marina?
Yes.
Yeah, he's this.
I can bellow, but.
I think they want to take it.
Okay. Thank you very much. First, I just want to add a footnote on this issue of, the fact that over and over again we see women's participation that gets nowhere. And there is a book by Frantz Fanon called The Fifth Year of the Algerian Revolution, which must have been written in 1959, where he talks about all the changes in social relations, particularly the position of women and the position of youth brought about by the revolution. And of course, we know that in 1962, things went back to the status quo ante. The question that I have is whether when we deal with the transitions in the Middle East, we really have a clear understanding of what is progress and what is a setback, particularly for women. Because I think we tend, and I'd like first of all to refer two things. One, refer back to what Steve Larrabee, I don't know if he's still here, what he said this morning for those of you who were here, that is how kind of the modernization of Turkey, of which the position of women was part, essentially, was really imposed from the top. That it was, and it was something that only reached a small part of the population. His estimate was 25%. I'm not, I don't know how to calculate it. You probably know more about it, but it was certainly not extending to the whole population. So that when we see then, but I'll use Turkey, but you can take any country. When you see them, women coming out and fighting in order to be able to attend university wearing the headscarf or working in government offices with a headscarf. When you see Tunisian students, women students, fighting to wear the niqab in class, the face veil in class. When you go, as I saw a while ago in Egypt, young women working in a factory in Alexandria that were all wearing the niqab. And those of you who know Egypt know that the niqab, usually it's a Saudi woman. If you see a woman in the streets of Egypt that wears the face veil, and wearing the veil on the factory floor. And it was not imposed by management, by the way. The management only imposed using safety pins and not straight pins, because the straight pins fall out and jam the machines, essentially. But when you see this, then you say, is this a step forward or is it a step backward? Because I would be inclined to say it is a step forward.
Who wants to take that?
Shall I take that? It sounds like a
Yes.
Turkey question.
Yeah.
Well, I actually, yesterday someone talked about whether there's a Turkish model or a Turkish inspiration, and I guess some of the activists that I've talked about today would not necessarily say it's a model regarding women's rights, but I would say that maybe it's a model in terms of the reversal of the headscarf ban. Maybe that's a model for Western Europe, which has not yet done that, which is going the opposite direction. It's banning headscarves. I think it's interesting that, from what I understand, in Egypt, something like 90% of women now cover. I mean, that it's been a growth over maybe since 9/11. I mean, that might. Oh, it hasn't been before. Oh, in the 80s. Okay, but now it's reached that point, and this was the feminist movement back in 1911 or something, was about getting rid of the veil. So it's kind of, what's going on is the question, and is some of that about this sort of return of patriarchy, returns of certain kinds of values? Is it also about some kind of defensiveness in the culture? I mean, that has something to do with West versus East. In other words, a representation, a cultural representation in a time when the region, including Turkey, is very much still exoticized and still othered by the West. I don't know. I haven't read the research on the meaning of that, but to some extent in Turkey, it's about that. It's about this is not necessarily about my religion, but it's about my culture. It's about who I am, and kind of a feeling of defensiveness at this time in history. Kind of defending our culture against the West, the way the West sees us. I'm also, there's kind of a backdrop I think we have to think about it in what's going on regarding gender in the Middle East, and that is the way that the West has seen, especially in these colonial contexts like Algeria, the way it's painted particular societies as a certain way because of the way they treat women. In other words, we can justify military intervention and colonizing them because of the way they treat women, and this is about modernization. And so we have that kind of backdrop to deal with in terms of, at least in terms of international interventions regarding gender. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Anybody else would
Yeah.
like to comment?
So I'm not an expert on Islamist feminism. I'm sure that Badrat would have given a thorough answer to this, but I'm going to give a crack on it. And I look at Morocco and Egypt, both with 50% rate of illiteracy. And as we all know, the history of the region, this question of progress, and you really are hitting an important question. How is it discussed? Who is discussing it? What is the context within which it was discussed? So as we all know, the reforms, of the late 19th century and early 20th century, looked at progress, and in many ways it was modernization. that was sort of framing the whole debate against the backdrop of colonialism. So we want to be different. We want to be the same. There was hesitation and tension right there. And the discussion was taken on by only elite women who engaged with this in newspapers and in magazines and tried to see, they also, they participated in progress, but it was very much westernization. What we are seeing today is sort of development, reaction, backlash, confusion, about what progress means and whether the return to the niqab, to the hijab. I think that, you really are hitting at a point that refers us to a lot of the discussions we've had about the increasing power of the Saudi model in the region and, the hegemony of their discourses, and their petrodollars. But you also see in that this is probably an important historical moment where if you interview women wearing niqab, hijab, and different variations of this veiling, some will tell you, because I don't want sexual harassment, and we know there is violence with niqab and sexual harassment with niqab. Some will tell you, I'll get more respect in these insecure times, and you will notice that they're not getting that. Some will tell you, I might get a job, and I will get, the support network for that. So there are various things, but for me, it's not a pessimistic moment. It's how women now are dealing with it and testing different waters. Where this is gonna go is very interesting because a lot of narratives are losing credibility in these transitional moments.
I just was in Jordan at a meeting of women parliamentarians in the MENA region. An Egyptian former member of parliament who was covered was telling that her sense is that quite a substantial number of young women as a protest now are removing their hijab. But I think these are anecdotal. As for the niqab and covering or not covering, I think just, Marina, the concept that you are free and feel comfortable to wear what you want and it is not imposed on you may be a sign of forward rather than backward. But the hijab and the niqab brings with it a lot of various interpretation and also limitation, because the expectation from a woman who is covered in the region is very different than from a woman who is not covered. So that is something we may want to look into. I think I'm told to give the floor to Christian. It's 3 o'clock. I was told to stop at 3. Christian.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Halle, for sharing this wonderful and I think very productive and interesting session. And my thanks to all of you. Maybe we should give first a round of applause. I wanted to just take this moment to highlight one additional activity here at the Wilson Center, and that is the Yon Ratio Democracy Award. I share this award every year. We give it to a democracy activist, an engaged thinker, or an activist. We've given this over the years to some prominent democracy activists. This past year, we gave it to Aung San Suu Kyi. We've given it to Adam Michnik or to Saad Ibrahim, one of the leading Egyptian democracy activists. We've also given us to emerging activists. My favorite is a young Russian blogger, Oleg Kozlovsky, 3 years ago. I would invite all of you, we're right now looking for this year's awardee. If you have any suggestions, you're all connected with this work in a scholarly, and I know many of you in practical political terms. Please let me know. We're collecting nominations, and then the board of former awardees plus selected others will select the finalist who we will bring this fall to the Wilson Center. He will be in residence here, allowed to be, hopefully take advantage of this to network in Washington. We'll also organize a symposium in his or her honor. So any ideas are welcome, and I'll put out some brochures in case you're interested with further information on this. And with that, I think we'll go to the coffee break, and then in half an hour we'll resume for the final roundtable, and we're looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.